Welcome to the Bet On Me podcast, the ultimate resource for softball players looking to take control of their training and reach their full potential. I'm your host, Krista Stoker, and on this show, we'll be discussing everything from taking a holistic approach to your training to data-driven strategies for maximizing and growing yourself not only on the field, but off. At S2 Breakthrough, we believe that athletes should lead their own journey and push past any perceived ceilings on their talent. So join us as we explore the world of softball player development and help you bet on yourself. Because when you bet on yourself, you can't lose. All right, back with an episode of me and Ashley, 3 of many to come. And today we were thinking that we would discuss a little bit this concept of sort of an athlete ceiling, or, maybe we've heard coaches say things like, maybe that's as good as she'll be, or we've seen athletes go through plateaus and feel like, am I going to get to the other side of it? So just this sort of journey that we've seen athletes go on, particularly girls and women that we work with in softball, and just talking through what we've sort of learned in the journey, the idea of, can you raise an athlete's ceiling? What is an athlete's ceiling? That topic. So we're just going to have a conversation about it, share some observations and data points that we've gotten in the past few years. And hopefully it's helpful for athletes to kind of understand that process. So the first question I'm going to ask you to talk about, Ashley, is maybe just this concept of like, what is a ceiling? Do athletes have ceilings? What is a ceiling? When people say things like, that's as good as an athlete will be, I hear ceiling. So what does that mean to you? Or what do you think an athlete's ceiling is?
Yeah, we're talking obviously about somebody's performance ceiling. And I think,
right.
This whole like bet on me concept is very much linked to I don't even want to call it a belief, because a belief is like, it's like opinion, but our now true understanding of how athletes can really just crush their own performance ceilings. And so, I think there's a couple of things we want to hit upon here. The first is, like, what are the types of ceilings that we're even talking about? This is a really important concept. A lot of times when we are talking, I don't even want to say young athletes, but most of the softball world is youth. So,
right.
when girls, young women are hitting puberty, that time period chronologically, it varies. Sometimes they're 9, sometimes 13, 16. So it varies across the board. And what we know is that leading up to that point, it just from a biological standpoint, they're growing, they're getting stronger, they're getting bigger. And so let's just take velocity for one. Their velocity will just keep going up, 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 up. So this is really an important concept. It is important. We really don't believe at S2 Breakthrough that athletes should ever link their success or their failure to like a particular person, a particular coach. And I think that one thing that always kind of like makes me like, I don't know, like chuckle or something, is if there are like pitching coaches out in the world who are like using pocket radars. And I'm not saying you shouldn't ever use a pocket radar just from like an intent and showing a pitcher, how she's doing, but to show that basically like, see, the program is working. You used to throw this when you were 10 and now you're 11. And there's really got to be this understanding that as athletes are getting older and older and they're approaching puberty, they're just, from a biological standpoint, they're going to keep throwing harder. That's just a reality. And so it stabilizes at some point, and that also varies somewhere between 6 months maybe would be the youngest, probably more like a year. For some athletes, more like 18 months to 2 years. It just really depends on how much height they really have gained, how much mass they are putting on. And so during that process where their body is really like stabilizing in this more like mature physical state, then all of a sudden we get to that point and now we have this performance ceiling. So genetics are involved in this, obviously. So there are athletes out there where their performance ceiling, again, let's just sort of talk about velo. It's an easy one to understand. Their natural performance ceiling post-puberty, maybe they're 3 years post-puberty, is like 64, 65. And then there are others where it's like 54, 55. And so we would just say like, obviously we're recruiting that athlete A and not athlete B, because her ceiling is just like way higher. And there's truth to that, obviously. Everybody has sort of like a different foundation. And so what we often hear at S2 are families coming to us like, this pitching coach got us to a certain point, but now they only know the basics because now they can't get me to the next point. And oftentimes, I don't know that pitching coach, so I'm certainly not going to weigh in on what they're even doing in sessions or whatever. But in my mind, I'm often thinking like, no, nobody got you to that point. Like just natural biology, right, growth got you to that point. And now you need a training program to intervene. And if it doesn't, that's kind of it. And not to say you maybe won't go up, any type of training might not help you go up a little bit here and there. But what we're talking about and what we're doing at S2 is to like literally bust past performance ceilings. So let me give an example. I don't think that there would be a world where a college coach would see a 15-year-old young girl throwing, let's say, 56, and for us to say, we think she could throw 65 by the time she got to college. Like, people don't see jumps like that because that would be like, not even just like, that would be blowing up somebody's performance ceiling. And so they're like, okay, if she's throwing 56, like maybe she'll hit 60. And so what we're really talking about at S2 is like, not just the normal, any training that you do, any lifting that you do, any sort of like workload management, maybe any work on efficiency and patterns might give you like one extra tier. We're really talking about, can we literally bust and blow up what the softball community thinks is possible? And we now know the answer is yes. And that doesn't mean that it's like every single athlete, as soon as you start training at S2 Breakthrough, then you're just going to bust. There's so many variables, which we could go into, of what really allows some pitchers. I'm talking pitching. Of course, this goes to hitters. This goes to
I know. I was like, I'll talk eventually about hitting, but
yeah,
it's okay.
But of course, my brain always goes to pitchers. But like, this is like, what we know is that essentially there are tons of variables that are involved. And like I said, we can kind of go into those, but this is what we're talking about. First is an understanding that this initial ceiling that you hit is science. It is biology. It is just in your genetics, what level, what size you are, what level of power you produce innately. And we just allow biology to get us there. We stabilize and that's it. And then there is this training, and from a general standpoint, as I said, sort of like whether or not it's ideal, optimal training or not, whether it's individualized, might help you grow past that within reason. And then there's a whole nother ball game that really what we're talking about, which we call player development, right? Which is like really understanding all of these details to get training right, to be willing to get the data, to be flexible and adjust the training and programming to make sure that we can keep athletes on the right track. So when we see, it's kind of tricky, like when we're talking to college coaches and we see an athlete who's 15, 16 years old and she throws 58, but we see her like the pieces of her puzzle, if you will, we're like, oh no, she definitely could throw mid 60s. But we find ourselves in difficult conversations. Like that doesn't really happen in our game. And so while we're like, I know this kid could throw in the mid 60s, at least who knows beyond that, it's very difficult to convince a sort of like set culture and mindset that someone could jump 8 to 10 miles per hour between high school and college. But we're like, no, she just had her period, a couple months ago or a year ago. There's just so many pieces that really allow us to understand what an athlete really could be capable of. So, and it shocks us sometimes. There are times where I have an idea of what a pitcher or an athlete might be able to achieve, and I'm just blown away. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about ceilings. And we never know, but we have conversations all the time. We have debriefs during assessments and families might say like, do you think she can change? And I'm always like, I mean, that's a given. Like how much we never know, but I mean, absolutely. We've had maybe two athletes ever where when we remeasured things, there was no change in the first couple of months. And all we were like, okay, we got to take a different approach. So we do, and we see change. So yes, when you get training right, I mean, it blows us away. So I think that there is this idea that we really have to start being willing to admit that we have no idea what an athlete can become unless we really start to understand these like underground variables that predict what it is that she might be able to achieve in 3, 4, 5, 6 years.
Yeah. I think I'm going to sort of not to make this full conversation about a woman's puberty journey, but I think it's really important to hammer that just a little bit more for people to understand, because I think that there is the amount of times that we have this conversation, which is my athlete was getting better and better and better and better, and now she has plateaued. And our next question is always, did she just have her period, or is she about to have her period? And the answer is 98% of the time, yes. I think that it is a part of a woman in particular's journey that is misunderstood, not talked about enough. You know, this, like, we're leading girls on a bad path where they think my path is supposed to be linear this direction, and that from a physiological standpoint is not possible. And so I think the first conversation to, like, the ceiling is how to navigate that time of a woman's, like, journey. And I think it's so important because what we know about our sport is it's rotational. And to rotate when your body has bigger boobs, has bigger hips, has added fat mass, which all happen around puberty, is harder, right? It is just the reality of what women go through at that time. It is harder. And so you do plateau at that point and have to relearn your body and have to sort of re-maximize your body. And the fact that we've ignored that is so detrimental. What we have found is just so unbelievably detrimental to understanding how much better athletes can be, the athlete's sort of mental health and understanding of themselves as an athlete around that time period. You know, they're taking care of their body around that time period. The stress fractures we see because they aren't eating enough, having periods, like, there's just so much wrapped into that. And I think that topic is just, like, you know, if you are in, what I'll just, like, say, and you can add to this, but if you are in girls sports and you cannot have that conversation for whatever reason, you don't feel comfortable having it, then you can't be in girls sports, because this is something that, like, we have to make people understand. I think it's just so crucial that the reason people think people can't get better in our sport is because we let them get to that point and then we tell them they can't get better. You've plateaued, you know, like, you've plateaued and we don't know how to help you, and that's your problem. And, like, you know, I think that we've hammered that message in girls over and over and over, and we've really created kind of a disastrous scenario at that point, for a lot of reasons. And so I think maybe just, I don't know, I can't say it enough. I don't know if you have to add to it, but it's just, like, so critical to talk about.
Yeah, I would say, like, you can't possibly even talk about performance ceilings if you don't know where a female athlete is, like, regarding when she hit puberty. I mean, I think, like, we have seen pitchers where they are, like, we go visit them for an assessment, or they come to us for an assessment. They're, let's say, mid-teenagers, 14, 15 years old, and they've been, like, a stud because they're big and strong and they can throw really hard. And so oftentimes what we find is that when we always ask, obviously, when was your first period? They're early bloomers. They're, like, 8, 9, they're 10 and under, essentially. There's no wonder why they're smoking everybody at 10U. You know what I mean? Like, this is just, like, that. It's crazy. And so what we often then find, because they are thrown so much, that then, and in your case, obviously, as we said, I'm always talking about pitching, but, like, it's the same concept of when they're rotating over and over and over. One, oftentimes these athletes are put at increased risk of injury because their bodies are still not really, like, I mean, the workload for these young girls is just so, it's crazy. But beyond that, what we often find then it's connected to this concept is their mobility is really low. They have sort of indicators that then are, like, they're kind of stuck, right? So this is where it's like, oh, well, she was early, she, really peaked early, and then that's it. Just because somebody peaks early doesn't mean it has to be it. But when they're overused to a degree that is like, well, now their body is stuck in, like, these horrible movements, and they don't have movement variability. And, that's why, like, we've done that to them. And instead we make it like, oh, well, you were just good early, and now everyone caught up to you. I think it's interesting, that, like, I get asked the question a lot, what should young pitchers do? And you always joke, and you should say your answer is, I don't know, I don't work with young pitchers, right? But, like, I want to
go to gymnastics.
Right. So I want to clarify why we like joke about that. So we don't work with young pitchers because of what we know about the motion. Basically, if we're like, okay, we know that to have efficient patterns, you have to be able to first stabilize the trunk in order to hold posture while essentially airborne to rotate well. Until this, like what I reference as maybe up to 2 years post an athlete's first period, until that point, there's no stability. And in fact, maybe there's a sense of stability, but that gets totally rocked. I mean, what we are talking about when an athlete starts to enter puberty, we're talking about females here. What we're looking at is like the pelvis expands. Literally something that does not happen in males. And so it's like, we don't ever have conversations like this. Like this athlete is going to be unstable, even if she wasn't a year or two ago. And so it's really important. What I would say is like, my best advice for anyone who is a young athlete, I mean, this would probably go across the board, but especially for pitching, which I would argue is physically the most complicated movement in the game. The best way to prepare yourself in order to be successful down the road is to really not do it. I mean, like, it's basically to like barely do it. Certainly do not train it because you can't. All you're going to do is try to force your body into certain like movements that are really against the concept of the body unraveling, the kinetic chain, just, having movement variability and just trying to like master these like positions, which ultimately backfires and ultimately lowers the ceiling. And so my advice to parents who may be listening to this is like to know that what your daughter is doing in the game. If she wants to be a pitcher, I mean, honestly, we could talk about hitting because it's the same, right? It's sort of like you have to make sure that you are really monitoring workload because rotating to that degree before you have the stability, you're going to be rotating from the wrong place. But from a pitching standpoint, because we know the abuse, I would call it, that pitchers' bodies really take from a workload standpoint, that's why I think it's really not only because my brain is often focused on pitching, but because I really think that concept puts pitchers at the center of this conversation. But what I would say is not to compare your daughter based on where her chronological age is. And if she wants to be a pitcher, let her do it for fun. Let her do it. Get out of pitching lessons when you're 10, right? And just watch. And then once she has her first period and then the body is starting to stabilize, obviously you're going to see that she's growing. She puts on mass. This is the time then where then you can train the skill. But leading up to that point, it's about just being a good athlete, being able to have a variety of movement solutions available to you. Training the skill of pitching until that point is literally counterproductive to then being able to be a pitcher down the road and to be one that has a really high ceiling. So it's interesting because how could we have this conversation when we don't even talk about periods for young women in sport? Let alone everything is in travel ball, which in of itself is a circus where a 10-year-old may be literally playing 7 games in a weekend. And all we're doing is just like, yeah, Sally, you pitched your ass off and you won the championship. And so we have no idea really like how detrimental that environment can be and how different that environment is for one athlete versus another based on where they are maturationally. So it's very difficult. We're a ways away having these conversations. I mean, I think a lot of times when we stopped really like we did train young athletes and back in the day, of course we did in all the wrong ways. We had that conversation, on our very first episode, but even recently, because we're like, you know what, let's just basically give them good strength and conditioning. It's gymnastics, as you said, right? It's understanding where your body is in space and just keep letting your body develop and have a feel for where it is in space. And then throw some plyos into a wall and make it free, have good movement solutions. But those are difficult because what we realize is like, we almost feel like we have to trick people because they want it to be pitching so badly. And meanwhile, they're like, well, then I'm going to go to my pitching coach who's going to teach me a curve and, my velocity is going to really talk about my mechanics. Like that can't exist. It's not like we don't feel like it. We don't feel like training. Right. That can't exist until you are developmentally ready. And so now, obviously, we're just like, we have to just make sure we have that conversation one-on-one with athletes. And until they are ready individually for the motion, for the skill, that's when they can enter our player development system. And that's the reason behind it.
You said, we can't even talk about the ramifications, except I would say we know a lot of the ramifications. So I think this is something we're working to get out more. But I always quote this number. I think the last time I made Laura run it, it was like 27%. 27% of the hundreds of athletes that we've done assessments are not having regular periods. And I think, we know that the system is putting, there's a lot that goes into that, but the system is doing way too much, filling their schedules with way too much, which is making them not have time to eat, take care of their body, recover. There is the pressures of being a woman in our society. So whether that is actively, a eating disorder or body dysmorphia or whatever it is, or it's sort of maybe not that, far yet, but I am trying to keep my body looking a certain way. We see that. And I think this system, we see stress fractures. I mean, the amount of athletes that come to us already having a pars fracture in their back, a stress fracture in their foot, like something at these young ages, 13, 14, because of what their body is taking. And so then when you layer then on top of that, coaches saying, well, she's just not going to get there. I think, you hear us getting fired up because you're like, well, you've actively put the system against her. And so this idea then that you're going to put a ceiling on her, this doesn't sit right with us, which is we see what's happening here. And what I would say is we're talking about performance, but if these athletes are having missing periods for years and years, they're going to get osteoporosis, they're going to have fertility issues. We're talking about their lives we're messing with. And I think that it's just, we get fired up about it because what we see from S2 is our athletes that bust these ceilings, and what you're describing, that sort of see these changes, have had to actively say, I'm going against that. I'm betting on myself. I'm going against that. I'm going to try to make sure I'm healthy. I'm going to try to make sure that I put things, we have conversations all the time. I just had a conversation with a 13-year-old who came for an assessment, and her dad said, she's one of two pitchers, so she pitches a lot, and we don't really say much, but we don't think it's right. And I said, you should say much. You have to say something. That's not disrespectful. You can't it's not okay to sit and watch your daughter just get used like this, because we see the ramifications of it. And yes, the very first ramification is it's going to affect your performance, and you're going to hit a ceiling performance wise, and that's going to happen. But, there's even beyond that of what you're going to do to your body as a result of that. So I think you hear us getting charged in this because we've seen the ramifications, and they need to be talked about, because that when we see, then we go to college conferences and college coaches are like, well, genetically, maybe she's just not that good. And, she's just going to have to come to terms with that. It's like, it's just like, yeah, I guess, but we also put her in the worst system ever and never talked about her period and never talked about her body and don't know how to train pitching. And so that seems a little unfair for that kid.
Yeah, I think, the system is not centered around the athlete. I think I'm not sure there's a person in the universe who could really be educated about the details of the system and be like, yeah, that's what's best for the athlete. It is centered around the adults, and that might not be the intentions, but it's the reality. So on the one hand, travel ball, in my mind, I always say that I call it a circus. It's because I'm trying to keep it clean. But what I would how I would actually describe it, I think it's abusive. What the stories that we hear, the workload, what we had an athlete who, she's not even in high school. She's in middle school. And she was like, oh, I'm so sore. I had a 7-hour practice yesterday, but we had a lot to work on. I'm like, okay, well, there's just there's this element of not understanding what the body is actually capable of. And instead, we hammer these kids. We absolutely hammer them. Forget, you know how I feel about workload. It is so wild to me. I always think what if we were in charge of pitch counts? All right, S2 breakthrough, you advise on what pitch counts can be. We'd be like, okay, at check-in, you have to say how old you are, how old were you with your first period. Let's measure your level of efficiency in your motion, because in reality, pitch counts would be a start. But the reason why I like pitch counts is okay, it would get us on the map. But literally, we're talking about how efficient or inefficient are her patterns. Where is she from a stability standpoint? Where is she from a standpoint of where she is maturationally. So there's so many concepts of what a pitcher can and cannot handle potential. There's such an individualized nature. So anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but like workload is such a huge part of what's a disaster about the young ages. There's no level of, you're talking about 3 tiers of no understanding of what's appropriate workload wise, no conversation about what's going on with a young woman's body and how it's changing developmentally. And then really what we're talking about is just, I mean, everything is centered around like in the now and whether or not she can do it in the now. And so basically the reason why this is so important is because the number one thing an athlete can do in order to raise her ceiling once she hits that biological plateau is to preserve herself. And what we're talking about, like advocating, not letting your daughter get overthrown, making sure you're educated, making sure you're not like, my pitching coach says I have to throw, 100 pitches. This is like these old school trains of thought. It's basically preserve yourself so that when you do then come on the other side of puberty, your body is stabilized. Now you're not trying to undo things. You're not trying to, which is a difficult process and takes a while. Now you're just starting. I mean, that would be the number one piece of advice that we would give families and athletes. It's just like, you have to be willing to do a hell of a lot less because no one is advising you when you're young to do it that way. That doesn't benefit, such and such coach, such and such who wants to win the national championship at 12U. That does not benefit him. So it's difficult. I get it. I'm not trying to say someone has bad intentions, a bad person. And so it's also difficult from the college side, from a recruiting standpoint. We have a lot, we have discussions all the time. The more that we dive into player development, the more we see like recruiting has a long way to go, a really long way to go. And one of those things is that as warped as that youth system is, it still dictates who gets recruited and who doesn't.
Yeah.
So like it still built the culture of understanding like why an athlete got squashed or, if an athlete is a certain age and only throwing this versus this. No one advocates for the pitcher throwing 57 because they're like, well, she's just stuck there. And so it goes both sides. So you have to really, this concept of like bet on me is deep. It is like fully understanding player development, knowing that you're in charge of it and knowing that it's going to take some guts because the system is not built around you. So that's really what we're talking here. It's like to preserve yourself despite the systems and the adults around you not telling you the same thing, which is really freaking hard. I mean, that's the reality of it. And so I think the flip side is like for us, when we have athletes and that come into our system, maybe they're preserved, likely they're not, because we're talking about something that's, the very early stages of a concept here. But is then, for us, what we started to realize is like, if we don't really even understand what happens in the skill, what happens in the pitching motion, for example, there's no way we're training it right. So like, what if we, and we kind of talked about these concepts a little bit in our second episode of like, how did S2 breakthrough get to where we are about this concept of like motor learning? It's like pairing these concepts, I guess 3 concepts. What is the skill? How does the body move? What are the individual variables for that athlete? And then how does the brain actually tell the body to make change? When those 3 come together, it's like fireworks, magic, as I said in the first episode, right? It's like it's fireworks. And we're talking about things like, we've trained pitchers, oh man, like keep the body still and just whip the arm. I mean, like we're talking about like literally training the arm and not the body. We're talking about things like make the body more unstable. That's how we train pitchers, like stand on something that makes you unstable. And we're going to call that balance. We're talking about things like spins that, and again, I'm not like, if you do any of these things, you're awful. I'm not trying to say that, but this is all we had. Right? It's just like make the body incredibly unstable. So the arm has to just do everything, has to decel all the energy by itself. Pretend the body as if the deceleration phase of the motion is linear instead of understanding the kind of complex nature of how the body unravels, how it transfers energy rotationally. Our lack of understanding of these concepts, all of us forever, really has just led to the wrong training modalities and strategies. And so when you then can start to really understand what is going on in the motion, we're talking about, we've got data, we have high-speed cameras, we have sensors. We have, data from a biomechanics standpoint, from a ball flight standpoint. Obviously, the types of things we do every day and at S2 Breakthrough is just watching how one influences the other. Then now we can actually target training. So this is not to say, because I think we started this whole podcast off of like, we are not above anyone. We are everyone. We just have decided like, this can't be right. And so we're on this journey to figure it out. But as far as I'm concerned, everything surrounding an athlete until they dive into a player development system is squashing their ceiling. Everything that's set up at the youth phase, everything around workload, everything with not understanding where they are around puberty. And then they get to that point and we're just drilling them with concepts that are not correct, are not actually happening. And there's a place for feel and intent and, having an intent to do something that's not real, but it has to have also an understanding of what's really happening and what, people might have different training strategies to get there, but we still struggle as a pitching community to get on the same page with like, what's really happening? What's really happening? Why shouldn't we really be doing drills where we are trying to decelerate the body's full energy, but not letting the body move? And so like there's some basic conversations like this, which are important to us to get out there because none of this is allowing athletes to get better. And so, yeah, what a journey. It feels like that's so many things, it's so many pieces, but to us, it's this concept of like, what's a ceiling and how do you bust it? It's all of those things and all of those factors go into it. So it's a lot and I get it. And not everyone can be like in every piece of it. But we have to understand that full journey for an athlete. And I would argue that, we barely get any of it. I think as at least on the pitching side, I would say we barely get any of it. And it's hard. It's really frustrating. I think this is why when we have athletes come to debrief, they cry a lot. We don't have a percentage. I don't really like keep data on who cries. Maybe
everyone cries. Yeah.
But a lot of people cry because what they'll say is like, she works so hard. She wants it so much. And I feel for those athletes. I see it in their souls. They want it so badly. And so all they know to do is work and work and work and to do what the adults around them that they know, love, and trust are telling them to do. But when that's inside of a system that is wildly warped, then they're just banging their heads up against a wall. So this idea of us like validating that, like, I know you're working hard, but it's in all the wrong places. We're going to rewrite the story. It's just the sense of relief for these athletes is incredible. That's player development. That's Bet on Me. And it has a lot to do, like I said, there are so many layers to what it even means and why we think athletes do just have these fixed ceilings. There's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's why, like I said, everything you just said, I think it's why we just, when anyone from our staff hears someone saying something about, well, I'm not going to recruit that kid because she's this good now and she's not going to get better, or it's too late, or whatever, it goes on and on, those types of things about an athlete. We just, I want to stand on a table and scream, which is like what we are feeding and what could be, what we find about softball. Listen, we've given our whole lives to it. What I find about softball is there's almost nothing more empowering than sports for women, and there's a lot of things that go into that, teaching you to see your body as, powerful, and it's helping you perform and putting you around amazing women friends and seeing mentors in the game and all of these things. It's unbelievably powerful, or it should be. And so when we see the system like, okay, but now we've put girls in a system that's the opposite of that. It's telling them you can't get better. You're stuck in these patterns, it's injuring them. It's taking their periods away. It's doing, just like, it's almost crazy. You say it's looks abusive. There's elements of it that really feels abusive to us. And I think that's why we feel so passionate about it, because we want women and girls and women to be in this system where they just feel so empowered, where they feel like they can bet on themselves. And, it feels like sometimes at every turn we're telling them they cannot do that. And that part feels really hard to swallow, as we've sort of seen the data come out of it and those types of things. So I think what I would say is, like, without question, people can bust and raise ceilings and can change performance and can become better and can be told that this size can only do this and they can do more than that, and without question. But to do that, you have to see the flaws in the system. You have to understand your body. You have to really dedicate to, like, going in this balance between health and wellness and performance maximization. And honestly, what I would say is, if you do that, you're going to get more from the game than you ever would have if you didn't. And so that's what's so powerful to us about S2. But also, I will say the caveat too, it's extremely hard to stay committed to that path on the current system. And so we feel very strongly at S2 that, like, we just want to build a better system where it's easier for our athletes to do that, because we've seen the possibilities when they can do that, but we also have seen the challenges to how challenging it is to be on that side of it, how much they have to go against everything else. And so I just think, as a coach, it is hard to know all of these things. I'm a volunteer coach, I'm this, I'm that. But if you are not willing to learn and outsource what is needed for girls to be successful, then I think, like, we have to put some limits on that, because we're really feeding girls the wrong message, I think. And it's, we've seen the effects of it. I think we do know the effects of it physically, mentally. There's a lot of really lasting negative effects. And then not to mention that part of that is this message of, like, this is as good as you're going to get, which is just not true. We've made that as good as they're going to get.
Right. No, for sure. I think, like, it's what I've always loved about this, like, kind of underground system of S2. There's no doubt about it. We obviously get athletes from all across the country who are very high level. Like, we're talking, some people hit this plateau and they throw 65 plus. Like, I mean, there are people just genetically who have, and honestly, that's who gets recruited. Those are the easy ones. Those are the reasons why we turn on TV. This isn't just we turn on TV and we see pitchers throwing upper 60s and 70, because all of those pitchers, like, likely almost none of them threw in the mid 50s at 16 years old. You know what I'm saying? So, like, we know that there's this tier at the top, and that's really all the game has relied on. And so we get those pitchers, of course, because, a lot of times it's injury. A lot of times it's like, I already have back pain, I already have hip pain, whatever that might be. But even they have great data, they have great ball flight data, but they know that something's not right because their body's breaking down already. So, but the big chunk of individual athletes that really see us do breakthroughs, like the tier just underneath that. Like, I throw 58 to 60. Like, I have good stuff. I think I have good stuff. And I only throw 58 to 60 and I'm stuck there. And so what I think is, like, this underground system of, like, we have given the stage, the big stage, to the athletes who look like college pitchers when they're 16 years old. Because that is obvious. Like we call it upside, but it's like, well, they're good enough now. So it can only, even if they stay the same, right? But this underground system is about educating athletes and their families about the types of things we're talking about now, the variables in the system, the internal variables of the athlete, and then really helping them transform from the athlete that is not identified in her early high school, mid high school years as someone who could be on that big stage. And our system,
is healthy.
Right. And we're like, you have 4 years? You have 4 years before you would even get to college. You have 4 years before. I mean, like, you have 6 years in your career left. Are you kidding me?
Right.
You think you can't throw 65 miles per hour? Just slow down now. If it's always a race to get there, you never get there. But if you're willing to take it slow, then you don't know what you can bust through. So I think that, like, underground nature, like you said, it's hard. But the reason why people come to S2 so passionate is because, like, I don't want to say they're, like, desperate. I don't mean that with a negative connotation, but, like, they have this belief in themselves. Like, I know she could be successful at that level, but, like, no one looks at her because she just threw a 61. But they know it. They just know it. And it's like, yeah, totally. We see what you're talking about. Let's go for it. So that excites me. And I think, like, for us, that is what player development is about. There's a piece of it that's like, take the athlete who already throws 70 and apply to player development. understand her workload, understand what pitches she has to maximize. Like, there's so many components of player development.
See if she can throw 75 because we have
for
no
sure.
idea.
Like,
We've never
not like
maximized kids.
Yeah, it's not like it's only
Right.
about one particular. But this, I think, where the game is just has a huge hole and where it could really explode is when we take all of these athletes who are in this mid tier, who we ignore on the big stage. And not to say the big stage is for everyone, of course, but we ignore them on the big stage because we're like, well, you don't look like that at 16. I'm like, she's 16 years old. You want her to be like that when she's 20, you know? So
Right.
it's just like, we have a totally different, but you're right. It takes an understanding of how you have to work against the system. You know, I always say, like, it's kind of nice from a pitching standpoint. Like, if you're the pitcher, you have some leverage, right? So like, you got to be willing to like, we kind of coach our athletes and their parents, like how to advocate for yourself while still being like we believe in like team culture, being selfless, being a team player, but those are different than advocating yourself. I mean, they're linked, but they are not like, if I advocate for myself,
you're not a bad teammate if you're trying to stay healthy.
No.
And the fact that we have told people that is crazy. Like,
no, we don't tell
just,
people
like,
that.
insane.
We tell girls that.
Right, children.
We tell
you're a
girls
bad
that.
team player because you're not playing,
Right.
you know. I think
no
I'm
one
reading
tells
this book,
Major
which
League
I've
Baseball
referenced.
players that.
No. And I'm reading this book, which I've referenced like 1,000 times. So if you're listening to this, go read Good for a Girl. It's amazing. But one of the things she referenced was watching Carrie Strug. That's her name, right? The gymnast. And just like we all celebrated because she competed with a broken ankle. And it's just like, that's not the right message. The amount of times we hear girls say like, oh, it's normal. My back hurts. And we've just drilled this into their head that like, to be a good teammate, to be tough, you're supposed to play through that. That's not right. There is a way to be a good teammate and a good person and a really tough without hurting yourself. And I think that that's really important. I'm going to wrap it up because we could go on for this forever, but I'm just going to finish with this thought, which I've been thinking about for a while, which is I always reference this. There's a lot of people in the game saying they want to grow the game, right? And I talk about this all the time because obviously we feel very strongly about this. So I think, you know, sometimes when people hear us being critical, it can sound like we don't want to grow the game, but it's the opposite, which is we are critical because we think we can do a better job of growing the game. And obviously our game has blown up on the highest level, which is amazing. And we're totally here for it. And all the ESPN games and the primetime World Series game and, you know, NIL stuff that's happening for, you know, a lot of the big programs. Like, we are here 100% for that because it's such a sign of how amazing our game is and how much people want to watch it. But I think we have to be very careful when we see that to separate that from what's happening at the youth level, because at the youth level, the numbers are not the same. And what we know about the game is it's going down in numbers, and the people participating at the youth level are getting less and less every year. And I think that that's really important to understand, that we're sort of we're narrowing the funnel, even while we're so happy about what's happening at this main stage. And if we really want to grow our game, we got to get that funnel bigger. And the concepts we're talking about are not only going to impact the biggest stage, because you're going to have more people performing at higher levels and not running into these ceilings, but also it's just going to make there be more, which is very important. When you talk about the power of softball, we want more people in it because it is such a powerful sport. It's such a good way to be surrounded by like-minded people, to compete, to do all of these things. But when we have a system that's going against the athletes, it just, you know, it becomes smaller and smaller. And so if we're truly committed to growing the game, then you have to take these concepts serious. You have to, you know, we need committees, we need conversations. If we're in the travel ball caucus at NFCA, these are the topics we should be talking about. That's just like, I'm going to say that, which is, how do we put out information and education about periods? How do we, you know, talk through this? This is how we're going to grow the game. I really believe that. And so there's no staff more passionate about that, and you can be critical and still want the game to grow. And I think that that's really important concept. So in conclusion, like, there are not ceilings on these athletes. We've created them. So there's, you know, some things we need to do to help our athletes see that they can really bust through it and they can control their own journey and become really as good as they want to be. All right, I'm going to stop there.
Well, S2 Nation, thanks for joining another episode of the Bet on Me podcast. Go out today, bet on yourself, and remember, when you bet on yourself, you can't lose.